CES, one of my human friends said that he cannot live without a microwave oven and a refrigerator. I think humans really like those electronic products. How do you think the digital transformation will change your daily life? Let me introduce our next speaker, Brian Markwalter, the Senior Vice President of Consumer Technology Association. Markwalter is responsible for CTA's extensive consumer research, market data and forecasting capability, and CTA's ANSI-accredited standards development program, which develops technical standards used in millions of products every year. CTA owns and produces Consumer Electronics Show, a global consumer electronics and consumer technology trade show. Markwalter will deliver a lecture on the new trends and the technology development seen at CES. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big hand to our special speaker, Brian Markwalter.
Thank you. And I had to video that. I'm sorry. That was awesome. And she got my name right, which is the most impressive part. I wanted to start. I'm going to talk about a trade show that happens in the U.S. It happens to be the biggest technology trade show in the world. So we're going to, it's so big, the easiest way to introduce CES is with a video. So if we could run the video first, please.
In its 50th year, CES 2017 catapults the connected world, driving the global technology industry as it continues to evolve and expand. From global brands to first-stage startups, companies of all sizes connect at CES to do business, secure funding, form partnerships, and launch innovation to the world's market. Connectivity is everywhere, and CES had it all, from smart homes and smartphones to self-driving cars and connected cities. 5G was a huge story. Powerful leaders from around the world convened at CES. Government officials, marketing execs, investors, retailers, sports influencers, content creators, they were all here. Innovation architects working together to use technology to transform our world and make it a better place. 50 years in the making, CES 2017 was powerful and record-breaking in every way. CES is the world's largest innovation event and will be back in Vegas for the 2018 show, January 9th through 12th.
All right, thank you. We'll start some my slides here. So I want to talk about digital transformation, which is part of the theme of the overall conference. I think it's been a fantastic conference. Thank you for sticking around 3 days now. There's been some incredible speakers, so I'm humbled to be here, able to talk about it. So you learned about CES through that video, through Allie, one of our spokespeople for the event. And I'm privileged to work for CTA that runs it, and it gives us a chance to sort of see in practice the digital transformation that we're all going through, and that much of this conversation here about inflection points I think is reflected in what we see at the show. As Allie mentioned, CES happens to be 50 years old this year. Our first show was in June of 1967, but the show has seen something on the order of 700,000 products introduced over its lifetime. Essentially every big breakthrough, every consumer electronics you know about, VCRs, DVD, HD TV, 4K Ultra HD TV, all were introduced at CES, and now we see all sorts of new things being introduced. For the first time, car companies are launching cars at CES, and that reflects everything that's going on in our world as things become more digital. I want to glance back. So I was around then. I was just happened to be little at the time. So our first show in 1967 was in New York, and you know, it was a reasonably sized show. It just not as big as what we have today with CES. So there were 117 exhibitors. There were about 17,000 attendees. Today we get 160 to 180,000 attendees. And it was 150,000 square feet, that's about 15,000 square meters, as opposed to more than 2.5 million square feet today. But one thing that was definitely true about the show is it was much more about entertainment. And the truth is there was almost nothing digital there, and that's all different today. So let's look back at what's happened in the meantime and how we got where we are today and how fast things are changing. So if we look back in the 70s, a couple of important things were happening. One is, pardon me, that's Marty Cooper. Dr. Marty Cooper did the first handheld mobile phone call in the US. So he's been credited with that. That happened in 1973. We did have some mobile phones, but they were usually in cars. But he began this transformation that has put us where we are today. The other big thing that happened, personal computers. Now there's a lot of argument over when exactly the first personal computer was. The Altair was launched in '74 in the US. These are not personal computers as any young people would know them today. They a lot of times had switches on the front to start them or get them running. And so we, very soon after this, Apple launched its products, and kind of the rest is history. I think this item in the middle, the compact disc player, I see as the very first truly digital mass market consumer electronics product. So then from there we went to DVDs and smartphones. Japan launched the iMode phone, so I give it credit for being a truly mass market, sold to millions of consumers, phone for accessing the internet. And now, as you all know, 2007, the iPhone came out. This is 10-year anniversary of the iPhone. And things are totally different nowadays with our ability to communicate and our use of smartphones. So one of the things that happens, I believe, is we reach these certain tipping points in the industry, and from that we all of a sudden have this sort of what I call profound innovation, and we see that in a number of ways. So on the left side here, you have the changes that are happening with computing. We all know about Moore's Law, so we understand the progression of computing. That's been talked about by a lot of people. Our connectivity, especially the internet, has grown. Our low power, how much power the devices themselves consume, how much we can do with them, and actually our power storage has improved. One of the other big changes is the cost of storing data, and that's combined with big data to mean that we can now hold a lot more information cheaply and use it. So there have been talks already here, I know, about the use of big data in business. And finally, the sensorization, and some of these are exactly related to our smartphone world. The prevalence of smartphones and their need for sensors, low power computing, connectivity, and storage all came together. And what happens is these things combine, so we end up with stuff like Airbnb or the sharing economy, where there's data, there's, in this case, unused capital, and people with phones who want access to something they didn't have before. AI is especially true, where we've seen a huge progress. I'll talk about that in just a second. And lastly, robotics. It's much harder to make mechanical things on the kind of scale of advancement that we get with Moore's Law, but it is getting much better, and part of that has to do with power and sensors and onboard computing. Let's take a look at AI, and I find this fascinating. There's actually a great presentation earlier today on AI and where it's going in the future. A lot of discussion about sort of the singularity and AI, where they reach sort of the human level of thinking. But we have a really long history with AI, interestingly. So there were people like Dr. Marvin Minsky built a form of a neural network called the SNARK in 1951. So way back then, we were using and still thinking a lot about what we call biomimetics, the idea of of using technology, mimicking biology with technology. So people are still thinking about, well, should computers behave like our brain does, which is not digital the way we think of computers. And so that debate was happening. 1960, Woodrow and Hoff were working on the phone system, and they built a kind of a adaptive computer, if you will, to process phone signals and turn them into bits. And so Marvin Minsky co-authored a book in the shortly around this time, sort of in the 60s, and he wrote about the limitations of AI, well, in particular about neural networks and what was called a perceptron. So he wrote this book, talked a lot about the limitations, and a lot of people now in hindsight, they call that the AI winter. So in the 70s, sort of the shine went off of AI and people went and did other things. Well, meanwhile, researchers kept working on it, and what we see is this coming together of computers and people who kept plugging away at artificial neural networks or convolutional neural networks. And so I think one of the great examples of how we see this sudden tipping point of progress is if you look at the voice systems today, like Siri and Cortana and Bixby. So in the 90s, if you gave a general speaker, if you just turned one of these systems loose with any speaker, they got almost everything wrong. They were not very good. And then even to about 2013, they were getting words wrong about 23% of the time. So what I'm talking about are these generalized systems that could listen to me or you or anybody, like some of these, the robots we see around the conference today. So in the end of last year, kind of beginning of this year, they hit human parity. So they're as good as people are at hearing and understanding what we say. Okay, I want to walk through a few areas that we exist today and how our digital transformation is changing things. So there's no question, and I think this has been part of other sessions today, we're becoming a more urban world. These are projections. UN has a study that looks at these projections. So by 2050, 2/3 of the world's population will be in urban areas. And so that's part of the motivation behind smart cities. There is not a single definition of smart cities, but I think what they do have in common is this interest in using technology to improve urban life. And at least in Europe, they've created a set of characteristics. They're outlined here: smart economy, smart environment, smart people, smart government, smart mobility, and smart living. Those are just characteristics, ways to think about smart cities. And so we know the number of smart cities are growing. In particular, the interest, I believe, in getting to smart cities and why, interestingly enough, at CES, we'll have a whole section of the show about smart cities, and you think, well, the show used to be about consumer electronics. Now it's about how we live in our world. So we're going to have to get to a form of sustainable urban living as we move towards 2/3 of the world's population being in those urban environments. Right now, the top two characteristics that we see being deployed in smart cities are smart environment and smart mobility. So if you think about it, smart environment, and by that I mean like our utilities, use of water, use of electricity, other infrastructure. There's a need today to be more efficient and clean in how we live. Smart mobility is the other one. So if you live in an urban environment, you know getting around can be difficult, and that's why consumers or the citizens demand smart mobility. But one of the things that sort of pushes back on the introduction of smart cities is, first of all, funding. Cities are often challenged to find funding. So given the choice between introducing new technology and, say, fixing a pothole in the road, people often fix the pothole. And then the other thing is getting citizens to engage and be involved in the smart cities. Another big transformation we see outside the city is once we go home, we are home. We're in our personal environment, and we're seeing a great deal of change in this space. So there's we call digital assistants, digital speaker assistants. I'm talking about the products like Alibaba's Genie, the Alexa Echo. Apple has a product. So there's dozens. Every big either e-commerce or internet company is introducing some form of digital assistance. They're growing, at least our projections in the U.S., they're growing by 50% or so. Right now, when we researched inside the U.S., it's about 8% penetration, but you can see how quickly it's growing. There's a huge battle among the technology companies to build these ecosystems around their products. So you see Apple trying to get products to connect to its system. You see Alexa, Amazon getting products to connect to its system, Google doing the same thing. And actually, I think the beneficiary are consumers, people like us. So now you can go get a digital assistant. You can get some lights from Philips. They're Hue lights. You can get a door lock from somebody else. And these smart digital assistants will integrate them together. There's still 1/3 of the people, even by 2050, right now, even more than 1/3 live in rural areas. And that's critical. So we will always have people in less urban areas, farming, other things, way of life. And there are special kinds of challenges in these rural areas. One in particular is broadband, and we see that as an issue around the digital divide that gets talked about a lot. And there are companies working very hard at delivering broadband into lower density areas. So I was having a conversation with somebody at lunch yesterday. He works for KT, and you know there's a dramatic difference between the geography and population density in Korea and the U.S. if you've ever visited the U.S. So we were talking about how far do you have to go. He was really asking, like, what's it like? Is there cell phone coverage throughout the U.S.? Well, no. In fact, I was telling him, so I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and you only have to go about an hour west of D.C. towards the mountains, and you can be in spots where there's no cell phone coverage, zero. I mean, you can ride for 15 or 20 minutes around the mountains and have no cell phone coverage. So it is a challenge, but companies like Google are introducing, working on their Project Loon. Microsoft has some really interesting work they're doing to reuse TV frequencies, which happen to propagate very far. And so they're doing deployments in Africa to introduce broadband using, reusing TV frequencies. So, you know, we've set TV frequencies aside many, many decades ago, and so they're, in many cases, available and being repurposed for internet access. Another, you know, we think about sharing economy, things like ride sharing or Airbnb, this room sharing idea, when I first think about it, I think of it like an urban thing. This happens in the city. Well, it turns out, especially in the U.S., there are 20% of the Airbnb listings are rural, but only 12% of the hotels. So there's a need. The hotels are not going to be built in rural spots, but a sharing economy kind of application opens up two things. First of all, it gives a place for people to stay in rural areas, and it makes income for people in the rural areas. The other fact that came out there is the hosts in rural areas make as much as the hosts in urban areas, which is a little counterintuitive to me when you think about the cost of living in the city. Lastly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we're going to have to get to more sustainable farming. So this picture here is a drone that's doing imaging over a sweet potato field in South America. We're going to see a lot more technology applied to precision agriculture. Things don't always go well in our cities and areas that we live, so we run into natural disasters. The U.S., you probably have seen, we've had 3 very large hurricanes hitting U.S., either the continental U.S. or territory. The picture on the left is from Nepal in 2015 that had a devastating earthquake. So one of the new technologies that's been applied are drones, and that's been, I think, an important application of fairly new technology. One that, interestingly, so drones have been around for a while, of course, in sort of industrial big drones, but the smaller drones that hobbyists started using are closer to what's being deployed in these disaster areas. So the FAA, picture on the right, FAA issued a bunch of waivers to use drones for assessment and figuring out disaster. And then in Nepal, it was interesting that, so two of the things they go in, first of all, of course, you have to deal with the immediate emergency of finding people, getting medical help, getting food and water and shelter. But one of the other things they do very quickly is get satellite communications up and running, because then people, even if it's just a little bit of communication, but they can communicate and get information about the situation in and out of the area. I want to talk a little bit about mobility. There's been a huge discussion about self-driving vehicles. We're spending a lot of time on it in the U.S. like everybody else is. It is a very big part of our show, which I find truly fascinating. So you saw in that video clip, you saw an Audi self-driving vehicle doing demos at CES. If you come, you can take a ride in a self-driving vehicle. It's kind of cool. One of the motivations is that driving today, getting around, is very costly. In the U.S., there's 37,500. That's the new figure for 2015. And about 90% of the crashes, this is the U.S. government figure, but about 90% of the crashes are due to some form of human error. Now that includes drinking and driving, just making mistakes, not paying attention, but all those combinations is more than 90% of the errors are from humans, which you can understand now why there's such a big push to automate driving. The cars themselves, there's only a limit to how safe you can make the vehicle itself. So as long, and we've gotten pretty good at that. So the structure of the vehicles, seat belts, airbags, that's all improved tremendously. But we're kind of getting to the limit of how much better they can get. So we're going to have to end crashes. And that's part of what people are doing. So some of the things that are coming together to help us along that path towards self-driving. One of the big ones, of course, is AI and this notion of aggregated learning. So right now, if you've ever taught a teenager to drive, or if you can remember when you went through that process, so we all do the same thing. The previous speaker, actually she just walked out, she talked about habits. Well, a bunch of what you do in driving is learning the habits, and then we all go out and make the same mistakes over and over again. So there's no shared learning. We don't collect all that knowledge together and get better. We just all independently go make those mistakes. But when Google goes out, and now they've put together something like 3 million miles of driving, that is shared among all their cars. So all that road experience, all that artificial intelligence learning is pushed out to those vehicles, and that's part of how we are going to make the systems better. On the right, I just want to show one of the other pieces I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but NVIDIA, which is a chip company, they made their business doing mainly gaming chips, GPUs. Well, it turns out that the kind of computing you need to do for gaming is similar to the kinds of processing you're going to do when you're taking in images for a vehicle and processing. And so they're doing tremendous work in embedding small computers that are super powerful and made to process the kinds of information we have for self-driving vehicles. There are some things coming together. Well, actually, I didn't know that we were going to have a speaker talk about Ollie today. So that's Ollie, one of its self-driving little vans, I guess you would call it. It's different. And one of the things we are seeing now is Transportation is changing so fundamentally, we can start forgetting about steering wheels and other things. So there'll be such fundamental changes in cars, it's going to free up a lot. Part of what's coming together, though, I think there are at least three things. One is ride sharing. So people are going to be less inclined to own cars. They'll be willing to share them. We're going to move towards electric vehicles. And lastly, this idea of narrow AI that I was just talking about. I want to go through, I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so I want to go through a number of things. The next section I want to talk about is our health and well-being. And so this is worldwide, it's personal, right? So we want to prevent illness, and we want to maintain our well-being. So malaria, there's something on the order of 200 million cases a year. There's about 400,000 to 500,000 deaths a year. Sadly, it's predominantly children under 5. 2/3 of the deaths are children under 5. And we have really good tools for fighting it. The main problem is detecting it and getting information, and then we're going to have to figure out treatment, but you have to have some data. So there are rapid diagnostic tests. They're paper-based. They're like early pregnancy tests. That stuff's pretty well understood. They're cheap, but it's prone to human error, and you don't really get any data back unless you write down and collect that data. So there are researchers who are using smartphones to read these rapid diagnostic tests and get the information back. In fact, there's this researcher here is working on QR codes embedded in the rapid diagnostic tests. So it would be truly data driven, and that information will be read by a smartphone and brought back. There's a company called Allergy Amulet. They're doing something kind of similar. It's not exactly a rapid diagnostic test. They have a specialized material, and this was invented by a lady. She took the research out of a university. She has a food allergy that's deadly, and what she found is when she goes out to eat, she never knows what's in the food. And so she used this technology. She puts it on these specialized strips, and it's a little thing that looks like a piece of jewelry. It's a little pendant, so you can use it, sample the food, and tell right away in an environment where you have not prepared your own food whether there's a contaminant, food in there that this person might be allergic to. A couple of other things are more AI based. So on the right we have Google DeepMind. A lot of the image processing is particularly in the medical world. AI systems do a particularly good job at reading that kind of information. So Google is working on the system for diagnosing diabetic retinopathy. And that will remove, so we think about this as like, well, are we putting doctors out of work? I don't think in any way does this put doctors out of work. I think it frees them to do higher value cases and takes out some of this other kinds of things, especially looking at images that doctors do. On the left is a simple image classification thing that tells you about the food you just took a picture of. And there's also some technology that we think fundamentally improves lives. On the left is a young man named Chris. He's using a product from a company called Esight. He's low vision. He's never really been able to see, so from birth, and it was not really treatable directly. I mean, there's no medical way to treat it. And on the right, so this company Esight makes these glasses, and for the first time ever, that's his mom in the background, by the way. So for the first time ever, he was able to see his mom. We also are seeing some great work going on with exoskeletons. Okay, let me get through just a few more if I can run over just a minute or two. So AR, I think the business world is going to be one of the big users of AR, but the business world also demands that something be productive, right? They aren't just going to use technology just because it's in the news or popular. And we're starting to see some evidence that AR adds to productivity. So Google has done some research in this area. Doctors are super pressed for time. A lot of it is recording information. AR can help that. We also know that in certain situations of doing complex maintenance, that AR can improve results. We see huge growth in VR ecosystems. You've probably figured out there's a Oculus demo out here, and I would say what I find fascinating, there's a lot of debate about whether VR is in some sort of lull. You know, is it going to make a difference? I think it will. There's some discussion today about high resolution VR. The technology has room for improvement, but right now there are some great applications. On the left, we're using it, there are companies using it to generate empathy. So for somebody to experience autism, you know, if you don't have it, you don't know what that's like. And this group in the UK has put together this VR experience that helps somebody else experience and be empathetic with what it's like to be autistic. On the right is some work that a museum did to capture Bronze Age, what it's like to live in the Bronze Age. Something we would never be able to do otherwise, right? I mean, you can have a museum display of it, but there's only so many people that can get to so many museums. In this way, you can transport all those experiences out to others. I'm going to skip fitness tracker market. I will tell you that people are passionate about their fitness and also about sports. So one of the things we see at CES, there's a huge section of the show that is about health and fitness. There's all sorts of sports stars there. And I think we will, even esports, which is a big new thing. So let me wrap up simply by saying that all these fascinating topics we're talking about here at the World Knowledge Forum, we see on display, and so it's been really gratifying to me to come here, hear some very deep discussion about the progression of technology and how it's going to change the world, and also to know that we get to see a lot of this being turned into reality every January. So come join us if you'd like. Thank you.